the stagecoach rattled into South Pass City, Wyoming on a blistering August afternoon in 1872, carrying a woman who kept her scarf wrapped tight around her throat, despite the oppressive heat that made the other passengers strip down to their shirt sleeves and fan themselves with whatever paper they could find. Victoria Jane Holloway pressed herself against the worn leather seat, watching through dust-filmed windows as the rough frontier town materialized from the shimmering waves of heat that rose from the packed earth. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the silk scarf for the 100th time that day, making sure every inch of damaged skin remained hidden beneath the fabric. The other passengers had stopped trying to make conversation with her somewhere around the Nebraska border, put off by her silence and the way she flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly in her direction. The stage jerked to a halt outside the Wells Fargo office, and Victoria's stomach twisted into knots so tight she thought she might be sick right there on the floor. She had never met Nathan Vincent, the rancher who had answered her advertisement with letters that seemed kind and measured, never demanding, never pushing for more than she was willing to share through careful words on paper. He knew about the scars. She had told him in her third letter, unable to bear the thought of his shock and disgust when they finally met face to face. His response had been simple and direct, saying only that scars were proof a person had survived something difficult, and survival was something he respected more than unblemished skin. But respect and acceptance were different things entirely, and Victoria had learned that lesson the hard way back in Philadelphia, where the whispers followed her down every street, and the pitying looks from former friends cut deeper than the flames that had marked her. "South Pass City," the driver called out, his voice rough from road dust and tobacco. 15-minute stop before we head on to Fort Bridger." Victoria gathered her small carpet bag and stood on shaking legs, smoothing down the sensible gray traveling dress that had absorbed enough dust to turn it nearly brown. She was the only passenger departing here, and the others watched with barely concealed curiosity as she made her way to the door. The driver helped her down with surprising gentleness, and then she stood alone on the wooden sidewalk, blinking in the harsh sunlight that made her eyes water after the dim interior of the coach. South Pass City sprawled before her in a collection of false-fronted buildings and tents, still clinging to the gold rush fever that had birthed it just a few years earlier. The main street churned with activity, miners and cowboys and merchants all moving with purpose through the afternoon heat. Horses lined the hitching posts, their tails swishing at persistent flies. Somewhere nearby, a piano played off-key, and the smell of cooking meat drifted from a restaurant that advertised elk steaks and wild game. Victoria searched the crowd for a tall man with dark hair, which was all the physical description Nathan had provided of himself. She saw several possibilities and felt her anxiety ratchet higher with each passing second. What if he took one look at her and changed his mind? What if his letters had been lies, and he was actually cruel or violent or worse than the man who had given her these scars in the first place? "Miss Holloway." The voice came from her left, deep and careful, and Victoria turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat held in both hands against his chest. He was tall, as promised, with thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between blue and green and gray all at once. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with small lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. He wore clean denims and a blue shirt that brought out those unusual eyes, and his boots, while scuffed and worn, had been recently polished. "Mr. Vincent," Victoria heard how thin her own voice sounded, reedy and uncertain. "Yes, madam." He took a single step closer, moving slowly as if approaching a nervous horse. "I hope your journey was not too difficult. August is a hard month for travel." "It was long," Victoria admitted, then felt foolish for such an obvious statement. Of course it had been long. She had come halfway across the country to marry a stranger. Nathan's mouth curved into a small smile that softened the rugged planes of his face. "I imagine so. Are you hungry? Thirsty?" "The hotel restaurant makes a decent meal, if you would like to sit in the shade for a spell before we head out to the ranch." The kindness in his offer made Victoria's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She had been braced for disappointment or disgust, not this gentle consideration. "That would be very nice, thank you." He settled his hat back on his head and gestured toward a two-story building across the street with a painted sign that read Rocky Mountain Hotel. As they walked, Nathan matched his stride to hers, never rushing or pulling ahead. He did not offer his arm, which Victoria appreciated. The thought of physical contact with a man she had just met made her skin crawl with memories she tried desperately to keep buried. The hotel restaurant occupied the front corner of the building, with large windows that had been propped open to catch whatever breeze might stir through the stifling air. Nathan guided her to a table near one of these windows and pulled out her chair before taking his own seat across from her. A tired-looking woman in a stained apron appeared almost immediately, and Nathan ordered coffee and sandwiches without consulting Victoria, then paused and looked at her with a slight frown. "Unless you would prefer something else. I apologize for being presumptuous." "Coffee and a sandwich are fine," Victoria said quickly. She was too nervous to eat anyway, but she appreciated that he had caught himself and asked. The woman disappeared toward the kitchen, and silence settled over their table. Nathan looked at Victoria with those calm, steady eyes, not staring exactly, but clearly waiting for her to speak first. His hands rested easily on the table, broad and calloused from ranch work, the hands of a man who knew hard labor. There was a thin white scar across his left knuckles, old and faded. "Your ranch," Victoria began, then stopped, unsure what she actually wanted to ask. "The Running V," Nathan supplied. "About 8 miles northwest of town, up in the foothills where the grass stays greener longer. I have about 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and a dog named Bear who thinks he is much fiercer than he actually is." Despite her anxiety, Victoria felt a small smile tug at her lips. A dog named Bear. He was the runt of the litter, and I thought giving him a big name might help his confidence. Nathan's expression remained serious, but Victoria caught a hint of humor in his eyes. "It mostly just confuses visitors who expect to meet an actual bear." The coffee arrived, strong and black and hot enough to scald. Victoria wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug and let the warmth seep into her palms. The scarf around her neck felt suffocating in the heat, but she did not dare remove it. "Not here, not in public, not where strangers could see and point and whisper." "I should explain," she started, the words catching in her throat, "about what I told you in my letter." Nathan held up one hand, gentle but firm. "You do not owe me explanations, Miss Holloway. Not now, not ever, unless you choose to give them. But you should know, I know what you told me, and that is enough." He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. "You survived something terrible. That is all I need to understand." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She had not cried in months, not since leaving Philadelphia, and she would not start now in a public restaurant with this stranger watching. But his words had hit something vulnerable inside her, some small piece of her heart that still wanted to believe in human decency. "Why did you place an advertisement for a wife?" The question came out more bluntly than Victoria intended, but Nathan did not seem offended. The ranch is doing well enough, but it is lonely work. I had a woman I cared for once, back in Missouri, but she married someone else while I was away working in the silver mines. By the time I saved enough to start the ranch, most of the eligible women in these parts had already chosen husbands or left for cities back east. He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity or bitterness. I am 32 years old, and I would like to have a family before I am too old to teach my children to ride. And you did not mind that I am 24 and unmarried? Victoria asked. Most men would find that suspicious. Most men are fools who care more about what others think than about finding a good partner. Nathan leaned back as the sandwiches arrived, thick slices of beef between fresh bread with cheese melted over the top. I care that you can read and write, which your letters proved. I care that you were honest about your circumstances, instead of hiding the truth until after we were married. And I care that you were brave enough to travel all this way to meet a man you knew only through words on paper. Victoria picked at her sandwich, managing a few small bites that sat heavy in her nervous stomach. Nathan ate with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to fueling his body for work rather than savoring meals. Around them, the restaurant filled with other customers seeking respite from the afternoon heat. Miners with dust-caked boots and sun-darkened faces. A family with 3 small children who chased each other between the tables until their mother snapped at them to sit still. 2 older women who watched Nathan and Victoria with obvious interest and whispered behind their hands. "People are staring," Victoria murmured, hunching her shoulders forward. "People in small towns always stare at anything new or different," Nathan said calmly. "They will tire of it soon enough and find something else to occupy their attention." But Victoria knew it was more than simple curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her scarf, on the way she kept her chin tucked down, on the careful distance she maintained from Nathan even across the table. They were wondering what she was hiding, what secrets lay beneath the silk wrapped around her throat. The familiar shame burned in her chest, the sense that she was marked and damaged and less than whole. "I would like to go to the ranch now, if that is acceptable," she said quietly, pushing her half-eaten sandwich away. Nathan studied her for a moment, then nodded and stood. He left coins on the table for their meal and retrieved Victoria's carpetbag from where he had set it by the door. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down with relentless intensity, and the street had grown even more crowded as the day wore on toward evening. Nathan led her to a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses, both dark bay with white blazes down their faces. He helped Victoria onto the bench seat with a hand under her elbow, the brief contact making her flinch despite his gentleness, then climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. The horses moved out at an easy walk, and South Pass City fell away behind them as they headed northwest into rolling hills dotted with sage and scrub pine. The road was little more than 2-wheel ruts through the grass, and the wagon creaked and bounced over the uneven ground. Victoria gripped the edge of the seat and tried not to think about what would happen when they reached the ranch, when she and Nathan would be alone together without the buffer of public spaces and other people. "The ranch house is not fancy," Nathan said after they had traveled in silence for nearly 20 minutes. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft upstairs where I sleep. There is a barn for the horses, a chicken coop, and a smokehouse. The well water is clean and cold, and the view of the mountains is about as fine as anything you will see in Wyoming." "It sounds nice," Victoria managed. "I want to be clear about expectations," Nathan continued, his voice steady and calm. "You will have your own room downstairs. The door has a lock, and you are free to use it whenever you wish. I will not enter without your permission. We will be married by the traveling preacher who comes through once a month, but that marriage will be in name only until and unless you decide otherwise." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "You would marry me without, I would marry you and treat you with respect, and give you time to decide if this arrangement suits you," Nathan said firmly. "I want a wife and a partner, not a frightened woman who feels trapped and miserable in her own home." The relief that flooded through Victoria was so intense it made her dizzy. She had feared this moment since agreeing to come west, the inevitable wedding night and the demands that would follow. The idea that Nathan was offering her time and choice was almost too good to believe. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you be so kind?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horses around a rocky outcrop before answering. "My mother was not kind to my father. She married him because her own father demanded it, and she resented him every day of their marriage. I grew up in a house filled with bitterness and coldness, and I swore I would never create that kind of home for my own children. Whatever happens between us, I want it to be because we both choose it, not because you feel obligated or afraid." Victoria turned to study his profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way he held himself with quiet confidence. He was not what she had expected. None of this was what she had expected. She had been braced for disappointment and discovered something that looked almost like hope. The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it, and the mountains rising purple and magnificent in the distance. The house was built of logs chinked with mud, exactly as Nathan had described, with a covered porch across the front and windows that glowed golden in the slanting afternoon light. The barn stood behind it, larger than the house, with a corral attached where several horses watched their approach with pricked ears. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and a vegetable garden showed neat rows of growing plants. As they pulled into the yard, a large brown dog came bounding from the porch, barking enthusiastically. He was shaggy and friendly-looking, with floppy ears and a tail that wagged his entire back end. "That is Bear," Nathan said with unmistakable affection in his voice. "He will want to smell you and determine whether you are friend or foe, but he has never met a person he did not immediately love." Nathan helped Victoria down from the wagon, and Bear immediately pushed his nose against her skirts, snuffling and wagging. Without thinking, Victoria reached down to scratch behind his ears, and the dog groaned with pleasure and leaned against her legs. "You have been accepted," Nathan observed. "That is a good sign." He carried Victoria's carpetbag into the house, and she followed with Bear trotting at her heels. The interior was dim and cool after the bright heat outside, and Victoria's eyes took a moment to adjust. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair, and shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was clean but spare, the home of a man who lived alone and saw no need for unnecessary decoration. A door to the left stood open, revealing a small bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt. "This would be your room," Nathan said, setting her bag on the bed. "I will sleep in the loft, and you will have privacy down here. There is a chamber pot under the bed, but the necessary is out back about 30 yards. I will show you once you have had a chance to settle in." Victoria stood in the doorway of what would be her room and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. It was small but clean, with a window that looked out toward the mountains and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. The bed looked soft, and after weeks of sleeping in boarding houses and stage stops, the thought of a space that belonged only to her was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathan nodded and backed toward the door, giving her space. I need to tend to the horses and check on the cattle before dark. Make yourself at home. There is food in the cold cellar if you are hungry and water in the pitcher. I will be back before full dark." He disappeared through the door, and Victoria heard his boots cross the main room and then the sound of the door closing behind him. She was alone, truly alone for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she unwound the scarf from around her neck and let it fall to the bed. The scars were a horror of puckered, twisted skin that stretched from just below her right ear down across her throat and collarbone, fading into smoother skin above her breast. The fire that had caused them had happened 3 years ago, when her father in a drunken rage had knocked over an oil lamp that shattered against her nightgown. She had been 21 years old, still living in her father's house because no respectable man would marry a woman without a dowry, and she had nearly died in the flames. Her father had died, overcome by smoke while trying to beat out the fire with his coat. Victoria had survived, but the doctors said it was a miracle given how much of her skin had been burned. She touched the scars now, feeling the rough texture that was so different from normal skin. In Philadelphia, men had turned away when they saw her. Women had gasped and crossed themselves. Children had pointed and asked their mothers what was wrong with the lady. The pity was almost worse than the revulsion, the sad headshakes and the whispered comments about how pretty she must have been before. But Nathan had not flinched when she mentioned the scars in her letter. He had not demanded to know how she had gotten them, or whether they extended beyond what was visible. He had simply said that scars were proof of survival, and survival deserved respect. Victoria pulled off her traveling dress, dusty and sweat-stained, and washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher. She changed into a simple cotton dress, pale blue and worn soft from washing, and braided her long brown hair over her shoulder. Without the scarf, her neck felt naked and vulnerable, but she was alone in this room with no one to see or judge. She could breathe freely for the first time in hours. Through the window, she watched Nathan moving around the barn, feeding the horses and checking their hooves with practiced efficiency. Bear followed him everywhere, occasionally darting off to investigate some smell or sound before returning to his master's side. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that spoke of routine and care, and a life built on steady work rather than chaos and fear. Victoria unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 other dresses on pegs driven into the wall and arranging her hairbrush and small mirror on the washstand. She had brought almost nothing with her from Philadelphia, having sold most of her possessions to pay for the journey west. Everything she owned in the world fit into one carpet bag and left the small room looking barely occupied. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Nathan returned to the house. Victoria heard him washing at the pump outside, then his footsteps on the porch. She wrapped the scarf around her neck again, tucking the ends into her dress, and emerged from her room to find him lighting oil lamps against the gathering darkness. "I thought I would make supper," he said when he saw her. "Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it will fill the belly." "Let me help," Victoria offered. They worked together in the small kitchen area, Nathan showing her where he kept supplies and Victoria falling into the familiar rhythm of cooking. It had been a long time since she had cooked for anyone other than herself, and longer still since she had shared the task with another person. Nathan was easy to work alongside, never getting in her way or criticizing her methods. He built up the fire in the cook stove and put on coffee while she mixed cornbread batter and stirred the pot of beans that had been soaking since morning. "You keep a tidy house," Victoria observed as she worked. "I was raised to believe that cleanliness was next to godliness," though I suspect my mother would find this place far too rough for her standards. Nathan poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Victoria. She grew up in a fine house in St. Louis and never quite forgave my father for bringing her west to farm. Is that why you said she was unkind to him? Nathan's expression darkened slightly. She made it clear every day that she considered herself above him, that she had married beneath her station. My father loved her despite it all, but it wore on him over the years. He died when I was 19, and I think part of him was relieved to finally rest. I am sorry, Victoria said quietly. It was a long time ago. Nathan took a sip of his coffee and leaned against the counter, watching Victoria spoon cornbread batter into a pan. What about your family? Victoria's hand stilled for just a moment before she forced herself to continue. My mother died when I was 12. My father raised me alone, and he was not a gentle man. She did not elaborate, and Nathan did not push. They ate their simple meal at the table while full darkness fell outside and the sounds of night insects rose in a steady chorus. The beans were good and the cornbread better, and Victoria felt some of her anxiety ease as her stomach filled with warm food. Tomorrow, I will need to ride out and check the herd, Nathan said as they cleaned up the dishes. You are welcome to come along if you wish, or you can stay here and rest from your journey. There is mending that needs doing if you prefer to keep busy, and the chickens will need feeding. I can feed the chickens, Victoria said. The thought of staying here alone did not frighten her as much as she expected. The house felt safe, solid, a place where the walls were thick enough to keep out the world. That night, Victoria lay in her narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. The creak of logs cooling after the day's heat, the distant call of an owl, bear scratching at fleas on the porch. Above her, she could hear Nathan moving around in the loft, the soft thud of boots being dropped and the rustle of blankets. Then silence, deep and complete. She touched the scars at her throat and thought about Nathan's hands, broad and calloused but gentle when he had helped her from the wagon. She thought about the way he had looked at her face, and never once let his gaze drop to the scarf around her neck. She thought about his promise that the door had a lock, and she was free to use it. For the first time in 3 years, Victoria Jane Holloway let herself imagine a future that might include something more than survival. The days fell into a pattern. Nathan rose before dawn and did his morning chores while Victoria made breakfast, strong coffee, and whatever she could create from the supplies in the cold cellar. They ate together in companionable silence, and then Nathan would head out to work the ranch while Victoria tended the chickens and the garden, and the endless small tasks that kept a household running. She swept floors and washed clothes and mended the shirts and pants that Nathan left in a basket by the door. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental cookstove and to churn butter from the cream Nathan brought from a neighbor's dairy cow. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains while Bear sprawled at their feet. Sometimes they talked, careful conversations about neutral topics like the weather or the price of beef in Cheyenne, or the book Nathan was reading from his small collection. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, comfortable with each other's presence. Victoria kept her scarf on always, even in the worst heat of the day when sweat trickled down her back and made her dress cling to her skin. Nathan never commented on it, never asked why she did not remove it when they were alone. He treated her with unfailing kindness and patience, and Victoria found herself slowly relaxing in ways she had not thought possible. 2 weeks after her arrival, the traveling preacher came through South Pass City. His name was Reverend Thomas Blackwell, and he was a weathered man in his 50s who rode a mule and carried his Bible in saddlebags that had seen better days. He agreed to marry Nathan and Victoria on a Saturday afternoon in the small church that served the scattered ranches and mining camps around South Pass City. Victoria wore her best dress, a dark green cotton that brought out the hazel flecks in her brown eyes, and she wove wildflowers into her braided hair. The scarf around her neck was cream-colored silk, the finest thing she owned. Nathan wore clean denims and a white shirt, and he had trimmed his hair and shaved so that he looked younger than his 32 years. There were no guests, except for 2 ranch hands from a neighboring property who served as witnesses. The ceremony was brief, just a few words about commitment and partnership and the sanctity of marriage. When Reverend Blackwell told Nathan to kiss his bride, Nathan leaned forward slowly and pressed his lips to Victoria's forehead, gentle and chaste, before stepping back. His eyes met hers with understanding, and Victoria felt something flutter in her chest that might have been the beginning of trust. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, legally bound but still sleeping in separate rooms. Nathan treated Victoria no differently than he had before, still giving her space and privacy, still asking permission before entering any room where she might be. The only change was that he occasionally took her hand when they walked together, his calloused palm warm against hers, and Victoria found she did not mind the contact as much as she had feared. Summer faded into September, and the air took on a crisp edge that spoke of the coming winter. The garden produced the last of its vegetables, and Victoria spent long days preserving food for the cold months ahead. She learned to can beans and tomatoes and to dry herbs that hung in fragrant bundles from the rafters. Nathan brought home elk meat from a hunting trip, and Victoria helped him cut it into strips for jerking and smoking. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Nathan spoke into the comfortable silence. "You seem happier than when you first arrived." Victoria considered this, rocking slowly in the chair Nathan had built for her from pine wood. "I am. This place feels like home in a way Philadelphia never did. I am glad." Nathan was quiet for a moment, then continued carefully. "Would it be acceptable if I asked about your scars? You do not have to answer if you would prefer not to." Victoria's hand went automatically to her throat, touching the scarf. Her first instinct was to refuse, to keep her shame and pain locked away where no one could see. But Nathan had been so patient, so kind, never pushing or demanding. Perhaps he had earned the truth. "My father was a drunk," she said softly. "He was a tailor, a good one when he was sober, but he drank away most of what he earned. The night of the fire, he came home from the tavern angry about something. I never knew what. He was shouting, throwing things. I tried to stay out of his way, but he followed me to my room. He knocked over the oil lamp and it shattered against my nightgown." Nathan made a low sound in his throat, something between anger and sympathy, but he did not interrupt. "I was on fire before I understood what was happening. The flames went up so fast. My father tried to beat them out with his coat, but the room was filling with smoke, and the curtains had caught, and everything was burning. Neighbors broke down the door and pulled me out, but by then—" Victoria's voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard against the memory of pain so intense she had prayed for death. "My father died in the fire. The doctors said I should have died too, but somehow I survived." "I am sorry you went through that," Nathan said quietly. "No one deserves such pain." People in Philadelphia could not look at me afterward. The scars are ugly, monstrous. I frightened children. Men turned away in disgust. I was a curiosity, something to pity or avoid. The old bitterness crept into Victoria's voice. "When I saw your advertisement, I thought perhaps in the West, where life is harder, people might care less about such things. I thought perhaps a man who needed a wife badly enough to advertise might be willing to overlook my disfigurement." "There is nothing to overlook," Nathan said firmly. "You survived a terrible trauma. That takes strength. Pretty words, but you have not seen what lies beneath this scarf." Victoria heard the challenge in her own voice, the test she had not meant to voice aloud. Nathan stood and moved to stand in front of her chair, looking down at her with those steady creek water eyes. "Then show me." Victoria's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the knot at the side of her neck. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep herself hidden and safe from his potential rejection. But another part, a braver part that was slowly growing stronger in this place of mountains and open sky, wanted him to see. Wanted to know if his kindness would survive the reality of her scars. Slowly, with shaking hands, she unwound the scarf and let it fall to her lap. The evening light was dim, but there was enough for Nathan to see the full extent of the damage. The twisted, puckered skin that stretched from below her ear down across her throat and collarbone. The way the scars pulled at her neck when she turned her head. The ruin of what had once been smooth, unblemished skin. Victoria forced herself to meet Nathan's gaze, braced for disgust or pity or the careful blankness that was somehow worse than both. But what she saw in his eyes was neither disgust nor pity. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like wonder. Nathan knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering near her throat. Victoria managed a tight nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. His fingers touched her scars with infinite gentleness, tracing the lines where smooth skin gave way to rough. His touch was warm and careful, exploring without hurting. Victoria held herself very still, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Then Nathan leaned forward and pressed his lips to the worst of the scarring, right where her throat met her collarbone. The kiss was soft and reverent, and when he pulled back, he said with complete sincerity, "Beautiful." The word broke something open inside Victoria, some wall she had built around her heart to protect it from further damage. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and a sob tore from her throat. Nathan gathered her into his arms, and she buried her face against his shoulder and wept for everything she had lost and everything she had found. "I am not beautiful," she choked out between sobs. "I am ruined, damaged. You are a survivor," Nathan said firmly, his hand stroking her back in soothing circles. "You are brave and strong and, yes, beautiful. These scars are part of you, and every part of you is precious." Victoria cried until she had no tears left, and Nathan held her through it all, steady and solid and real. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her outburst, Nathan wiped her tears away with his thumbs and smiled at her with such warmth that she felt it down to her bones. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Never apologize for feeling," Nathan said. "You have held yourself together through more than most people face in a lifetime. You are allowed to fall apart sometimes." That night, Victoria did not put the scarf back on. She walked bare-necked through the house, feeling the cool evening air on her scars for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. Nathan looked at her openly, not staring but not avoiding her gaze either, and Victoria realized that he truly did not see her as monstrous or ruined. He saw her as whole, as worthy, as beautiful despite the marks she bore over the following weeks. Something shifted between them. Victoria found herself seeking out Nathan's company more, sitting closer to him on the porch, reaching for his hand when they walked. The easy companionship they had built deepened into something warmer, something that made Victoria's pulse quicken when Nathan smiled at her or brushed past her in the kitchen. Nathan seemed to feel it too. His touches lingered longer, his eyes followed her with unmistakable affection. But he never pushed, never demanded more than Victoria was ready to give. He let her set the pace, let her come to him in her own time. October brought the first real cold snap, frost painting the windows in delicate patterns and the promise of snow in the air. Nathan worked long hours preparing the ranch for winter, repairing the barn roof and stocking the woodpile and bringing the cattle down from the high pastures. Victoria helped where she could, feeding the animals and making sure supplies were organized and ready. One afternoon, Nathan returned from town with fabric wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Victoria with a slightly sheepish expression. "I thought you might like to make yourself a new dress, something warmer for winter." Victoria unwrapped the paper to find wool in a deep burgundy color, soft and fine, more expensive than anything she had owned in years. Her throat tightened with emotion. "Nathan, this is too much." "It is a gift for my wife," he said simply. "You deserve nice things, Victoria." She threw her arms around his neck before she could think better of it, standing on her toes to hug him tight. Nathan's arms came around her waist, and they stood there in the kitchen holding each other while Bear watched with his tail wagging. Victoria breathed in the scent of him, leather and wood smoke and clean sweat, and realized with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with her husband. The thought should have terrified her. Love made a person vulnerable, gave another person the power to hurt them. But Nathan had proven over and over that he was not a man who took pleasure in causing pain. He was gentle and patient and kind, and Victoria wanted to trust him with her heart the way she had learned to trust him with her scars. That evening, after supper had been eaten and the dishes cleaned, Victoria stood in the doorway to Nathan's loft and called up the stairs. "Would you come down here, please?" Nathan appeared at the top of the stairs, his shirt unbuttoned and his feet bare. "Is everything all right?" "Yes." Victoria's voice shook slightly. Could you come down?" He descended the stairs, concern written across his face, and Victoria took a deep breath and forced herself to speak the words she had been practicing in her head all afternoon. "I do not want separate rooms anymore." Nathan went very still. "Victoria, I want to be your wife in truth, not just in name." She met his eyes, refusing to look away despite her nervousness. "If you still want me, if I still want you," Nathan's voice was rough with emotion. "I have wanted you since the moment you stepped off that stage. But I will not rush you, will not make you feel obligated." Victoria closed the distance between them and kissed him, cutting off his words. It was the first real kiss they had shared, and it was awkward at first, both of them uncertain. But then Nathan's arms came around her, and he tilted his head to deepen the kiss, and Victoria felt heat bloom through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure." And Victoria was. For the first time in years, she was absolutely certain about something. Nathan took her hand and led her to what had been her room but was now theirs. He lit the lamp beside the bed with trembling fingers, and then he turned to her with such tenderness in his eyes that Victoria felt her last defenses crumble away. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Nathan replied. And then there were no more words, only the quiet communion of two people learning to trust and cherish each other in the most intimate way possible. Winter settled over the ranch with howling winds and snow that piled in drifts against the barn. Nathan and Victoria spent the long, dark months learning each other, talking late into the night about their pasts and their dreams for the future. Victoria told Nathan about her mother, a kind woman who had died too young of consumption. Nathan shared stories of growing up on the Missouri farm, the good memories as well as the difficult ones. They read together from Nathan's small library, taking turns choosing books and reading aloud by firelight while the wind rattled the shutters. They played cards and told jokes and made love with increasing confidence and joy. Victoria discovered that her body, which she had thought ruined and undesirable, could bring and receive pleasure. Nathan worshipped her scars with his kisses, tracing them with his fingers and his lips until Victoria no longer saw them as marks of shame but as part of her story, her survival. On Christmas morning, Nathan gave Victoria a silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant. She put it on and never took it off, wearing it proudly against her scarred throat. Victoria gave Nathan a new shirt she had sewn from the burgundy wool, and he wore it to the community Christmas celebration in town, his arm around her waist and his pride in her written clearly on his face. The people of South Pass City had grown accustomed to Victoria over the months since her arrival. A few still stared at her scars, but most simply accepted her as Nathan Vincent's wife, a quiet woman who kept a good house and helped neighbors when they needed it. Victoria made friends with some of the other ranch wives, women who understood hard work and isolation and the particular challenges of frontier life. She learned to see herself through Nathan's eyes, not as damaged or less than, but as strong and capable and worthy of love. Spring came late to the Wyoming mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought a profusion of wildflowers and the joyful sound of birds returning from their winter migrations. Victoria discovered she was pregnant in April, and the news filled both her and Nathan with a happiness so intense it was almost frightening. "A baby," Nathan kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." Victoria's pregnancy was not easy. She was sick most mornings and exhausted by mid-afternoon, but Nathan picked up the slack without complaint, taking over many of the household tasks while Victoria rested. He fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate enough and did not work too hard, and Victoria found his concern endearing rather than suffocating. In December, during a blizzard that buried the ranch in 3 feet of snow, Victoria went into labor. Nathan sent for the midwife from a neighboring ranch, but the woman could not get through the drifts. So Nathan delivered their son himself with hands that shook, but remained steady where it counted, talking Victoria through the pain and fear until finally, miraculously, a baby's cry filled the small bedroom. They named him James Thomas Vincent, after Nathan's father and the Reverend who had married them. He had his mother's brown eyes and his father's dark hair, and he was perfect in every way. Nathan cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he looked from the baby to Victoria with wonder written across his features. "Thank you," he whispered to Victoria. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me everything." Victoria had never felt more complete than she did in that moment, lying in their bed with her husband and her son, Bear keeping watch at the foot of the bed, and the wind howling outside. She had survived fire and shame, and a journey halfway across the country to find this life, this family, this love. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and small joys and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting together. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved the ranch and the animals and exploring the mountains with his father. When he was 3, Victoria gave birth to a daughter they named Rose Catherine, a sweet-tempered child with her father's creek water eyes and her mother's gentle nature. Victoria never completely forgot the pain of her past, but it faded into something distant and less sharp, a reminder of how far she had come rather than a weight pulling her down. She wore her scars openly now, no longer hiding behind scarves or high collars. The people who mattered did not care about the marks on her skin, and those who did matter were not people Victoria needed in her life. The ranch prospered under Nathan's careful management. He expanded the herd and improved the bloodlines, earning a reputation for quality cattle that commanded good prices in Cheyenne and Denver. He built a new room onto the house for the children, and later added a proper bathing room with a copper tub that Victoria considered the height of luxury. On their 10th anniversary, Nathan took Victoria to Denver for a week, leaving the children with trusted neighbors. It was Victoria's first trip to a real city since leaving Philadelphia, and she marveled at the electric lights and paved streets and shops full of goods from around the world. But she was happy to return to the ranch, to the mountains and the open sky and the life they had built together. James grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of ranching and his mother's quiet strength. Rose became a schoolteacher, riding into South Pass City 3 days a week to educate the children of miners and ranchers. Both children knew their mother's story, how she had survived the fire and come west to start over, and they treated her scars as simply another part of her, no more remarkable than the color of her hair or the sound of her laugh. When Victoria was 48 years old, Nathan 56, they celebrated their 24th anniversary with a gathering of friends and family that filled the ranch house to bursting. Their children were grown but still nearby, James working the ranch with Nathan and Rose married to a young lawyer in town. There were grandchildren now, 3 boys and a girl who called Victoria Grandma Tori and climbed all over Nathan demanding horseback rides and stories. That evening, after the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, Nathan and Victoria sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The mountains rose purple against the darkening sky, and the air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Bear had died years ago, but his grandson Brutus sprawled at their feet, equally useless as a guard dog and equally beloved. "You ever regret it?" Victoria asked, her head resting on Nathan's shoulder. "Marrying a scarred woman you met through an advertisement?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could feel him considering the question seriously as he always did, never dismissing her concerns no matter how many times they had covered this ground. "I regret that you suffered to get those scars," he said finally. "I regret that people were cruel to you because of them, but regret marrying you? Never, not for a single moment of a single day." He turned her face toward his and kissed her, the same gentle, reverent kiss he had given her scars all those years ago on this same porch. Victoria kissed him back, tasting coffee and contentment and the deep abiding love that had sustained them through 24 years of marriage. "You are the best decision I ever made," Nathan murmured against her lips. "And you are mine," Victoria replied. They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, 2 people who had found each other across a vast country and built a life that neither had dared to dream possible. Victoria's scars would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She was so much more than the trauma she had survived. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had known both terrible pain and profound joy. The night air grew cool, and Nathan helped Victoria to her feet. They walked inside hand in hand, past the photographs that lined the walls documenting their life together. Their wedding day, stiff and formal in their best clothes. James as a baby, wrapped in the quilt Victoria's mother had made. Rose on her first day of school. Family gatherings and holidays and everyday moments that added up to a life well lived. In their bedroom, Victoria unpinned her hair and let it fall around her shoulders, still thick but streaked now with silver. Nathan helped her with the buttons on her dress as he had done 10,000 times before, his fingers steady and sure. They climbed into bed and held each other in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. "I love you," Victoria whispered. "I love you too," Nathan replied. "Today and always." Victoria closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The girl who had stepped off the stage 24 years ago, wrapped in scarves and shame, would hardly recognize the woman she had become. But Victoria recognized her, cherished her, and was grateful every day for the courage it had taken to answer that advertisement and travel west into the unknown. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did on a working ranch. There would be cattle to tend and meals to cook and grandchildren to spoil. There would be laughter and hard work, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived in partnership with someone who saw her clearly and loved her completely. But tonight, Victoria simply rested in her husband's arms and counted her blessings. A home in the mountains, children and grandchildren who brought her joy, friends who valued her for who she was rather than judging her for what she had survived. And Nathan, always Nathan, who had looked at her scars and called them beautiful, who had given her the time and space to heal, who had loved her with a patience and tenderness that had transformed her life. The scars would always be there, visible reminders of the worst night of her life. But they were also proof that she had survived, that she was stronger than the fire that had tried to destroy her. And in the end, those scars had led her here, to this life, to this man, to this moment of perfect peace. As Victoria drifted off to sleep, she thought about all the frightened women out there who believed their scars, visible or invisible, made them unworthy of love. She wished she could tell them what she had learned, that the right person would see past the damage to the strength beneath. That survival was its own kind of beauty, that love could heal wounds that went deeper than skin. But mostly she just felt grateful, profoundly and humbly grateful, for the advertisement that had brought her west, for the courage to answer it, and for the man who had been waiting at the end of that long journey with kindness in his eyes and love in his heart. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the creek murmured its eternal song. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully, their lives intertwined as completely as their hands beneath the quilt. And on the mantel, a clock that Nathan had bought for their 5th anniversary ticked steadily toward tomorrow, toward all the tomorrows they would share, building a legacy of love that would outlast them both. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons turning and children growing. Victoria found that age suited her, bringing a confidence she had never possessed in her youth. The silver in her hair matched the silver necklace Nathan had given her that first Christmas, and the lines around her eyes spoke of decades spent smiling and laughing rather than hiding and fearing. James took over more of the day-to-day running of the ranch, as Nathan's joints began to ache in the cold mountain winters. But Nathan still rose early most mornings, unable to break the habits of a lifetime, and he and Victoria would share coffee on the porch while watching the sun paint the mountains gold and pink. These quiet moments had become even more precious with time, a space carved out of busy days where they could simply be together. Rose's children were frequent visitors to the ranch, especially during summer when school was out. Victoria taught her granddaughter Sarah to bake bread and churn butter, passing down skills she had learned in this very kitchen all those years ago. The boys, wild and energetic, followed their grandfather everywhere, absorbing his knowledge about cattle and horses and the land that sustained them. One summer afternoon when Victoria was 52, she stood in the garden picking tomatoes and heard childish laughter from the barn. She looked up to see Sarah, now 7 years old, running toward her with James's oldest son Thomas, age 9, chasing behind. Sarah's dress had gotten caught on something, and there was a tear in the sleeve that revealed a scrape on her arm, probably from climbing where she should not have been. The little girl stopped in front of Victoria, breathing hard from running, and waited to be scolded. But Victoria simply examined the scrape, determined it was not serious, and sent both children to the pump to wash up before coming inside for cookies. As she watched them go, squabbling amiably about whose fault the torn dress was, she thought about how different this childhood was from her own. These children knew they were loved unconditionally, that minor mishaps would be met with practical care rather than anger. That home was a place of safety rather than fear. That evening, while mending Sarah's dress, Victoria mentioned the incident to Nathan. "I want our grandchildren to always feel safe here," she said, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "I want them to know that mistakes are just part of learning, not something to be punished for." Nathan looked up from the ledger where he was recording cattle sales. "They do know that. You have made sure of it, just as you made sure our own children knew it." "My father would have beaten me for tearing my dress," Victoria said quietly. "He would have said I was careless and wasteful, and he would have used his belt to make sure I did not forget the lesson." Nathan set down his pen and crossed to where Victoria sat in her rocking chair. He knelt beside her as he had done that first night she showed him her scars, and he took her hand in his. "That man was a poor excuse for a father, and the world is better off without him," Nathan said firmly. "You broke that cycle, Victoria. You made sure our children and grandchildren know only love and patience. That is a gift beyond measure." Victoria squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his touch. "We made sure of it together." "Together," Nathan agreed, and he kissed her knuckles before returning to his ledger. The seasons turned and the ranch continued its steady rhythms. Victoria's days were full of cooking and cleaning, mending and gardening, and the countless small tasks that kept a household running. But they were also full of moments of pure joy. A grandchild's hug, the first taste of strawberries from her garden, the sight of Nathan riding in from the range with the mountains behind him, the feel of clean sheets on the bed, and the sound of rain on the roof, and the smell of bread baking in the oven. When Victoria was 55 and Nathan 63, they took another trip, this time to Yellowstone to see the geysers and hot springs that had become a national park just a few years earlier. They traveled with James and his wife Margaret, making it a family adventure. Victoria marveled at the strange beauty of the thermal features, the rainbow colors and the smell of sulfur, and the power of the earth revealing itself in steam and boiling water. Standing at the edge of Old Faithful, waiting for the geyser to erupt, Nathan slipped his arm around Victoria's waist and pulled her close. "You remember when you first arrived, how you hid from the world behind your scarf," he murmured in her ear. "I remember," Victoria said. "Look at you now, traveling to see wonders, standing here with your head held high and your scars visible for anyone to see." Victoria touched the necklace at her throat, the turquoise smooth under her fingers. "You helped me find my courage." "No," Nathan said firmly. "You always had courage. I just gave you a safe place to let it show." Old Faithful erupted with a roar, sending a column of water and steam high into the air, and Victoria leaned back against her husband's chest and watched the spectacle with wonder. She thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off the stage in South Pass City all those years ago, and she felt a rush of affection for that younger self who had been brave enough to take a chance on an unknown future. The years that followed brought changes, as all years do. Rose's husband died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her a widow at 34 with 3 children to raise. She moved back to South Pass City to be closer to family, and Victoria helped care for the children while Rose worked to support them. It was a difficult time, but the family pulled together, and slowly Rose found her footing again as a single mother. James and Margaret had 2 more children, both girls, and the ranch house rang with the sound of young voices during family gatherings. Nathan built a swing in the big cottonwood tree near the creek, and there was always at least one grandchild pumping their legs and shrieking with delight while others waited their turn. Victoria's health remained good despite some arthritis in her hands that made detailed needlework difficult. She adapted, finding other ways to contribute and help. She became known throughout the region for her herbal remedies, knowledge she had accumulated over decades of trial and error. Women came to her for help with difficult pregnancies, childhood illnesses, and the various ailments that afflicted frontier families far from doctors and hospitals. Nathan's body wore down more noticeably than Victoria's. Decades of hard physical labor had taken their toll on his back and knees, and by the time he was 70, he needed a cane to walk any distance. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued to oversee the ranch operations even as James took on more responsibility. On their 35th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted 3 days. There were children and grandchildren everywhere, and Victoria cooked for what felt like an army, helped by her daughters-in-law and granddaughters who had grown into capable young women. They roasted a whole pig and baked pies and cakes, and filled the house with music and laughter. Standing in the middle of the chaos, watching 3 generations of family that had come from nothing more than a mail-order bride advertisement, and a leap of faith, Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. Nathan appeared at her elbow, moving slower than he once had but still solid and steady. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How blessed I am," Victoria said simply. "How incredibly, impossibly blessed." Nathan pulled her into a dance despite there being no music, just the voices of their family filling the air. They swayed together in the kitchen where they had cooked thousands of meals side by side, and Victoria rested her head against Nathan's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you more today than I did on our wedding day," Nathan said softly. "And I loved you very much then." "I love you more than I have words to express," Victoria replied. They danced until Nathan's knees protested, and then they joined the party, accepting toasts and well wishes from children and grandchildren who clearly adored them both. Rose gave a speech about her parents' love being a foundation that had shaped her entire life. James presented them with a hand-carved sign for the ranch gate that read, "The Running VEST, 1870, Vincent Family Ranch." Later, after the party had wound down and the grandchildren had been tucked into every available sleeping space, Victoria and Nathan sat on the porch in their customary spots. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. 35 years, Victoria mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I stepped off that stage. Other times it feels like I have always been here with you. Both are true, Nathan said. Time is strange that way. Victoria thought about all the years they had shared. The good times and the hard times, and the ordinary times that made up the bulk of a life. She thought about how Nathan had never wavered in his love and support, how he had stood by her through difficult pregnancies and sick children, and the inevitable conflicts that arose in any long marriage. She thought about the respect they had built, the partnership that made them stronger together than either was alone. "If I could go back and tell that frightened young woman on the stage one thing, what do you think I should say?" Victoria asked. Nathan considered the question seriously. "I would tell her that she is about to discover her own strength, that the scars she carries do not define her unless she lets them, and that love, real love, sees past surface damage to the beauty underneath." "That is 3 things," Victoria pointed out with a smile. "Then I am overachieving," Nathan replied. and they both laughed. The following years brought the inevitable sorrows of aging. Friends died, old neighbors sold their ranches and moved away. The world changed in ways that sometimes felt too fast to comprehend. Automobiles became more common, though the rough mountain roads still favored horses and wagons. The Great War came and went, touching even South Pass City as young men left to fight and some did not return. Through it all, Nathan and Victoria held fast to each other and to the life they had built. They celebrated births and mourned deaths, welcomed new family members and said goodbye to old friends. The ranch remained their anchor, the place where they belonged and where their family gathered. When Victoria was 68 and Nathan 76, he had a stroke that left him weakened but still present, still himself. Victoria nursed him with the same gentle care he had always shown her, helping him relearn how to walk without falling, patiently waiting while he struggled to find words that had once come easily. It was hard to see this strong man diminished, but Victoria had learned long ago that love meant staying through the difficult times, not just the easy ones. Nathan recovered more than the doctor expected, though he never regained his full strength. He walked with a pronounced limp and tired easily, but he could still get around the ranch with help, could still sit on the porch and watch the grandchildren play, could still hold Victoria's hand and tell her he loved her. 2 years later, on a cool autumn morning with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, Nathan died peacefully in his sleep with Victoria beside him. She woke to find him gone, slipped away so quietly she had not even stirred, and the grief that crashed over her was like drowning. For 50 years he had been her partner, her love, her safe harbor, and now he was gone and she was alone. The family gathered for the funeral, and they buried Nathan on a hill overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains he had loved. Victoria stood at the graveside with her children supporting her on either side, and she said goodbye to the man who had changed her life, who had seen her scars and called them beautiful, who had loved her with a constancy that had never wavered. In the days and weeks that followed, Victoria moved through her grief slowly and carefully, like walking through deep snow. James wanted her to move in with him and Margaret, but Victoria refused. She was not ready to leave the house where she and Nathan had built their life, where his presence still lingered in every room. She spent her days in quiet routine, tending the garden and feeding the chickens and mending clothes. But the evenings were hard, when she sat on the porch alone and watched the sun set without Nathan beside her. Sometimes she talked to him anyway, telling him about her day and the grandchildren's antics and how much she missed him. Sometimes she just sat in silence and remembered. One evening, about 3 months after Nathan's death, Victoria's oldest granddaughter Sarah came to visit. Sarah was 27 now, a married woman with a baby of her own, and she found Victoria sitting on the porch staring out at the mountains. "Grandma, are you all right?" Sarah asked gently, settling into Nathan's chair. "I am managing," Victoria said, which was the truth if not the whole truth. Sarah was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly. "Will you tell me the story of how you and Grandpa met?" Victoria had told this story many times over the years, but she had not told it since Nathan died. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, but then they flowed more easily as Victoria talked about answering the advertisement, about the long journey west, about Nathan meeting her at the stage and offering her coffee and a sandwich instead of immediate judgment. "He was so kind from the very beginning," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "He gave me time to trust him, space to heal. He looked at my scars and saw beauty instead of disfigurement." "Grandpa was special," Sarah agreed, "but so are you, Grandma. You were brave enough to start over, to build a new life in a strange place. That takes incredible strength." Victoria looked at her granddaughter, this young woman who carried forward the legacy of love that she and Nathan had created together. Sarah had Nathan's eyes and Victoria's determination, and she was raising her own daughter with the same values of kindness and acceptance. "Your grandfather taught me that scars do not make a person less worthy of love," Victoria said. "I hope I have taught you the same lesson." "You have," Sarah said firmly. "You taught all of us to be strong, to be kind, to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. That is a gift that will live on through all the generations that come after you." Victoria felt tears slide down her weathered cheeks, but they were not entirely tears of grief. They were also tears of gratitude for the life she had lived, the family she had helped create, the love that had sustained her through everything. Victoria lived another 7 years, dying peacefully at the age of 77 with her children and grandchildren surrounding her bed. Her last words were Nathan's name, and those who were present said she smiled as she slipped away, as if seeing someone she had missed terribly. They buried her next to Nathan on the hill, and the whole community of South Pass City turned out for the funeral of the woman who had arrived as a frightened mail-order bride and become a beloved matriarch. The preacher talked about her kindness and her strength, about the way she had faced adversity and emerged victorious, about the legacy of love she left behind. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through James to his children and grandchildren. The house was preserved as much as possible, with Victoria's rocking chair still on the porch and Nathan's books still on the shelves. New generations of Vincent children grew up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandparents met, how Nathan had looked at Victoria's scars and called them beautiful, how love and acceptance had built a family that endured. The scars that Victoria had carried all those years became part of the family legend, a reminder that beauty comes in many forms and that true love sees past surface imperfections to the strength and courage underneath. Young women in the family who faced their own challenges, their own scars both visible and invisible, took comfort in knowing that their great-great-grandmother had overcome and thrived. Years turned into decades, and the West changed from frontier to settled land. South Pass City shrank as the gold played out and people moved on to new opportunities. But the Running V Ranch remained, a constant in a changing world, a testament to two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the mountains turned purple in the fading light, those who loved the ranch liked to imagine they could still see two figures on the porch, sitting side by side, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they had loved. Two souls who had found each other through a mail-order bride advertisement and a leap of faith, who had built a life together based on respect and kindness, and a love that saw past scars to the beauty beneath. Their story became the foundation upon which generations built their own lives, a reminder that love in its truest form is patient and kind, that it sees beauty where others see only damage, that it heals wounds deeper than any fire can burn. And in that way, Victoria and Nathan Vincent lived on, not just in the family that descended from them, but in the values they had embodied and passed down through the years. The mail-order bride who arrived with burned scars across her neck had found not just a husband but a true partner, not just a home but a sanctuary, not just acceptance but genuine love. And the cowboy who had kissed those scars and called them beautiful had found a woman of remarkable strength and courage, a wife who made his house a home, a partner who stood beside him through 50 years of joy and hardship. Together they had created something rare and precious, a love story that endured beyond death, beyond time, a testament to the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of loving and being loved, of choosing kindness over cruelty and acceptance over judgment. Their legacy lived on in every descendant who chose compassion, in every person who looked past surface differences to see the human being underneath, in every act of love that healed old wounds and created new possibilities. And so the story ended not with death, but with continuation, not with loss, but with legacy, not with scars, but with the beautiful truth that those scars had led Victoria Jane Holloway to Nathan Vincent. And together, they had built something that would outlast them both, a family and a love that would echo through the generations, a reminder that beauty comes in many forms and that true love sees them all.